Greetings from Miami. It's my distinct pleasure to be a part of the 6th edition of ICMR 2021, organized by Sabaragamuwa University of Sri Lanka. Before I begin my presentation, I would like to express my sincere appreciation for a number of individuals that have been responsible for putting together this wonderful conference. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge Professor Udaya Ratnanaike, who's the Vice Chancellor of the university, Professor Atula Nyanapala, who's the Dean of the Faculty of Management Studies, Professor Devasuri Jayanta, who's the Chairman of the conference. And the next person that I'd like to acknowledge is a fellow keynote speaker and the father of marketing, Philip Kotler. I'm really honored and humbled to be another fellow keynote speaker along with Philip Kotler. And then there's a finance professor, distinguished finance professor, Professor Ken Baker, who's also going to be giving a keynote speech. I'd also like to acknowledge Ms. Sangeeta Menon of Emerald Publishing, as well as Disha, who's from Emerald and behind the scenes organizing all of these things, as well as the partner universities, institutions, conference committee, and the various sponsors. There are a lot of hands on the deck, so to speak, to bring this conference together. And once again, it's a distinct honor and a pleasure for me to be able to deliver this keynote address. The topic I've chosen for my talk, as you see, is sustainability and service quality, a proposed framework and implications for service innovations. There are two key parts to my presentation, as you see from the first part of the title, sustainability and service quality. Now, several of you already know that much of my own scholarly work over the past 4 decades or so has been on quality of service. So I've done a lot of research in the area. Now, sustainability is an area that obviously is becoming increasingly important to both private and public organizations, to countries, to regions, to a number of different organizations, particularly the United Nations also is being a prime driving force in terms of sustainability issues. And sustainability is a very new area for me. And some of the work that I'm starting to do in this area is to try to see what is the linkage between quality of service and sustainability. And it is in this regard that I'd like to propose a framework linking the two constructs of sustainability and service quality, and then very briefly examine some of the implications of the linkage for future of developing more services and service innovations and so forth. So that's what I plan to do. So let me begin with a very, very broad overview of sustainability and a concept called donut economics, which I will come to in a minute. First, just looking at sustainability, there is no formal definition, universally accepted definition of sustainability. There are a variety of different definitions if you go into the literature, but one thing that is very clear from those various definitions is that there are three major pillars of sustainability: the environment, the economy, and society. And as you notice from this diagram, these three pillars are intertwined. These are not independent pillars, but intertwined pillars. The idea here is that sustainability goes beyond just environmental concerns. In fact, many of the more recent definitions of sustainability talk about the fact that sustainability goes beyond just environmentalism. It also involves the economy. For example, if you don't have a certain degree of economic growth, you cannot really sustain the environment. On the other hand, if too much economic growth can damage the environment. By the same token, you also cannot ignore society, which is the third pillar. For societal well-being, you need a certain amount of economic development. Again, there's a delicate balance, though. Too much economic development can damage the environment, or overconsumption on the part of society can also damage the environment. So the three pillars of sustainability are interlinked, as you see in the diagram here. Now, within the business domain, there is an analog for these three different environments that you see within parentheses in the three pillars: the planet, profit, and people. In the business domain, the management domain, this is often being referred to nowadays as the 3P framework, PPP framework. So you need to, as companies and as organizations, you need to focus on profitability and sustainability from that perspective. And profitability is important for companies and organizations to do, invest in the environment, invest in society, and so forth. And again, as we already said, societal well-being depends on a certain amount of economic growth. But at the same time, overconsumption on the part of consumers in society and overgreed on the part of companies within the economy can damage the planet, can damage the environment, can damage the planet. In other words, basically at a macro level, we have the environment, society, and economy. At a more organizational level, there is this focus now, increasing focus now on triple bottom line, which goes beyond just the traditional focus on profitability to more to be more inclusive of people as well as the planet. Now, moving to the right-hand side of this diagram, as again, most of you might be familiar, there are certain sustainable development goals that have been spearheaded by the United Nations over the past couple of decades or so. There are actually 17 different categories or 17 different buckets of SDGs, as they are called, Sustainable Development Goals. Now, we are going to talk about these in detail, but the main point I want to make here is that various sustainable development goals that are in these 17 different categories of goals, they are all anchored. They are all anchored back in one or more of these three pillars. So in summary, sustainability, as we are going to look at it, consists of a whole host of sustainable development goals, all of which kind of relate to one or more of these three major pillars. So I'm going to next move on to a related concept, a very interesting concept called donut economics. So if you look at the bottom of the diagram here, I have a source. This concept of donut economics was actually coined by an economist by the name of Kate Raworth in the United Kingdom a few years back, now 2016 or 2016. She came up with this whole notion of donut economics, which was a very intriguing concept, is a very intriguing concept for me because it is the one that actually inspired me to look into trying to connect some of my own work, long history of work over 4 decades in the area of quality of service, with sustainability. Now, let me very briefly again overview what this donut economics concept is all about. First of all, in the diagram here, without looking at any other words, you see that there is a green set of concentric circles. This is actually the donut, donut-shaped sort of core of the concept. So this green core is the donut, and you see there that there is an inner green circle, which is labeled as the social foundation. The main idea here is that from a sustainability perspective, societal needs with respect to things such as clean water, minimum amount of food, good health, education, gender equality, social equity, and so on. Certain minimum levels of those things have to be met by societies for societies to be able to survive and thrive in the long run. So this social foundation is kind of like the minimum level of well-being that need to be achieved in these various categories. And typically in many countries, even in advanced Western countries like the United States, there are some serious shortfalls, at least on some of these different criteria. Then at the outer boundary of the donut, we have another boundary which Kate Raworth labels as an ecological ceiling. And as you can see here, particularly from economic development and societal consumption viewpoints, too much economic development, indiscriminate economic development, and too much overconsumption of resources can have negative effects on things such as ocean acidification and climate change. Climate change, as we all know, is a very, very big topic these days, ozone layer depletion, and so on. The planet, the Earth, is actually being overtaxed on many of these characteristics already because of this uneven development, economic development, overdevelopment, and overconsumption, and so on. So the point of the donut economics concept is that for a safe and just existence of humanity, economic activity, consumption activities, and environmental development activities have to be within the donut, not below the inner circle of the donut, neither should it be above the outer circle of the donut. In other words, there are two different boundaries. One is the societal foundation boundary, which is almost like the minimum level, and then the ecological ceiling, outer boundary, which is the maximum that societies and economies can afford to produce without damaging the environment. Now, as I said, this donut concept was especially appealing to me because some of my service quality work and the insights stemming from that have some analogs to this. And I will come to that later in the presentation, but I wanted to begin my presentation by giving you this general overview of sustainability. First of all, in terms of the fact that sustainability is not just about environmentalism. It's anchored in those three different pillars of environment, economy, and society. And there are multiple criteria in the form of SDGs, or strategic development goals, put out by the United Nations. And those SDGs are actually captured in all of these different things that you see in this chart on the idea or concept of donut economics, climate change, health, and so on. All of these things are incorporated in the SDGs. So this is kind of an overview of sustainability. Now let me move into my own research in the area of service quality. There are lots of things that have emerged from my 40 years worth of work in service quality, but I want to just focus on 2 or 3 major concepts which are particularly relevant for what I'm going to end my talk with in terms of a linkage between sustainability and service quality. I would like to start first of all with the so-called GAPS model of service quality. Again, some of you might already be familiar with this. Basically, the gaps model was one of the first things that emerged in the mid-1980s from my stream of research on quality of service. Let me walk you through this very quickly. If you just focus on the left-hand side, the gaps model says that from a customer's perspective, from a user's perspective, quality of service can be defined as this gap or discrepancy between what they expect an excellent service organization or an excellent company to deliver and what they actually believe they are getting from a specific company. So as long as there is a gap between the customer's ideal or desired level of expectations and their actual experience of the perceived service, there's going to be a service quality gap. So if you label this gap as gap 5 is the external expectation perceptions gap that customers or consumers experience. If you label this as gap 5, as you see from this chart, there are 4 major internal service organizational gaps. These are gaps 1, 2, 3, and 4 within a service organization that in turn contribute to this external service quality gap. So let me again very quickly go through the 4 major internal organizational gaps. The first is the market information gap. Gap 1 is the market information gap, and as you see from this diagram, it's the disconnect between what customers' actual service expectations are and what an organization or a company or management within an organization thinks customers' expectations are, the organization's understanding of customers' expectations. And even to this day, many organizations don't have a precise and accurate understanding of what customers' expectations really are. The second gap is what I call a standards gap. The standards gap has to do with a situation where even management, even when an organization and its management are aware of customers' expectations, do they translate that understanding into concrete guidelines or specifications? Again, a lot of companies today, even though the managers, senior executives might know what customers really want, they may not have specific guidelines or standards within the company to be able to deliver to those expectations. So that's gap 2. The gap 3 is the service performance gap. And as you see here, even when companies do have certain standards, they may not have the resources and the internal infrastructure to be able to deliver to their own internal standards. In other words, their own internal performance by their people and by their systems may fall short of the internal standards. So that is gap 3, or the service performance gap. For example, a good example of this might be McDonald's. And as many of you know, McDonald's is an organization that is well known for standardization. They have concrete standards, specific standards for almost every aspect of preparing and delivering fast food, including cleanliness of the restaurants, how often the restaurant should be cleaned, everything else, everything connected with preparing and delivering food, speedily and efficiently and in a clean environment has a series of standards. However, within McDonald's, are all McDonald's restaurants able to meet all of those standards all the time? No, of course not. Actually, in the United States, I don't know about other countries, in the United States, there are a lot of problems with McDonald's these days. In fact, in the fast food industry, McDonald's consistently ranks at the very bottom in terms of customer satisfaction scores. Now, why is that the case? It's not because of lack of standards, but it's because of the inability of the organization to consistently deliver to their own internal standards. And then the last gap, or gap 4 here, is the internal communication gap. The internal communication refers to the fact that departments and touch points within the organization where customers might come in contact with the organization are not well coordinated internally. For example, the marketing department of a company might be putting out a lot of promotional messages, advertisements, television commercials, and so on. Which might obviously influence the customer's expectations, as you see from the model there. These are the communications that come out of the organization and affect customers' expectations. But the actual people that are delivering, that are supposed to deliver on what is being promised to customers, are from an entirely different department. Typically, within organizations, is the operations department. For example, in a bank, it's the bank tellers that are supposed to deliver the service to the customers. It's the systems, the electronic systems and so forth that are supposed to deliver the service. But the marketing people are the ones that are communicating the messages to consumers. And to the extent that the operations people and the marketing people don't coordinate very well, don't communicate very well within the organization, there are bound to be some disconnects between what was promised to customers and what gets actually delivered to customers. And that is the internal communication gap. So to summarize then, the GAPS model basically brings together the customer's perspective of quality of service in terms of this expectation perceptions gap, together with an organization's perspective in terms of potential internal disconnects, of which there are 4 major categories here, gaps 1, 2, 3, and 4. So the idea here is that to truly improve quality of service, organizations need to systematically understand and close gaps 1, 2, 3, and 4. In other words, unless gaps 1, 2, 3, and 4 are closed, gap 5 is not going to close. Now, from a sustainability perspective, one other point that can be made with respect to this GAPS model is that all of these internal gaps are going to be responsible for inefficiencies. Inefficiencies in that resources are going to be consumed within the organization, and because of that, the profitability of the organization might go down. The dissatisfaction of customers because of those internal gaps can lead to greater expenditures needed to attract new customers, to resolve customer problems, and so on. So these gaps collectively are going to be detrimental to one or more areas of the PPP bottom line that I mentioned before: profits, people, and the planet. Wasted resources obviously damage the planet, or could ultimately damage the planet. Customer dissatisfaction stemming from the existence of these gaps and frustrations that customers experience can lead to lack of consumer well-being, and ultimately lack of societal well-being, and thirdly, the planet as well, and the profitability. And the profitability of the company itself is going to go down because of these inefficiencies within the organization. So that is another point that I will come back to a little later. So moving on from the GAPS model, a second major concept that I would like to touch on based on my research is that this market information gap is a major disconnect in many firms, even today. Even today, it's a major disconnect. To give you an example, here is an example from my own personal experience from staying at a major 4-star, 5-star hotel called the Sahara Star Hotel in Mumbai, India. This hotel is a famous hotel that's just outside the Bombay or Mumbai International Airport. And a couple of years ago, I was staying at that hotel for a business purpose. And when I checked into the hotel and went up to my room, everything looked nice, as it should in a 4-star, 5-star hotel. And one of the things that attracted my attention as soon as I walked into my room is this electronic bedside control panel. As you can see here, this is a very compact sort of device, electronic device, from which the customer, right from the bed, can control all of the mechanical and electronic sort of devices in the room. For example, the temperature control, opening and closing curtains can be done. The lighting intensity can be changed for the different lights and so on. So in theory, this kind of a device is supposed to delight customers, right? It's something that is very, very high tech, consistent with all of the high tech things that are coming down the pike these days at a very, very fast pace. But the problem was that even though I'm a mechanical engineer, it took me about 15 minutes to properly understand all of these controls. There was no instruction, so I have to kind of learn by trial and error. But being an engineer, I was curious, so I didn't mind spending the 15 minutes or so to try to learn all the controls. And I thought I had learned all of the controls. So then I went out for my series of meetings that day, and late at night I came back to the hotel, and I was getting ready to sleep, got into bed, and I started turning lights off, closing the curtain and so on, using the electronic bedside control panel. For the first couple of buttons seemed to work, I was able to close the curtains and so forth. And then as I started turning lights off, I could not turn the bathroom light off from the control. Maybe, I was too tired and I couldn't see that particular button, or maybe, the button itself was malfunctioning or whatever, so I couldn't turn the bathroom light. So then I said, okay, let me get out of bed and go to the bathroom and manually turn it off in the bathroom. Then I went to the bathroom, I looked around, but I couldn't find the manual switch. So maybe again, because the manual switch might have been hidden somewhere, I was too tired. I don't know, whatever the reason is, it seemed like I had to come back to the control panel to do anything that I wanted to do in the bathroom with respect to electrical connections. So, finally, after a lot of frustration, I thought I'll just shut the door of the bathroom. When I shut the door of the bathroom, the light was still coming through the bottom of the door, through the crack, the bottom of the door. So I just resorted in frustration to a real low-tech solution where I took a towel from the bathroom and kind of spread the towel around the crack to block the light. So why am I, kind of repeating, elaborating on the story? Simply to say that, there's a serious disconnect. This implies a serious disconnect between what I as a customer expect. I didn't expect to see an electronic control panel. The hotel provided it. Once they provided it, it increased my expectations, right? So, and this must not have been a very cheap proposition. I'm sure the hotel spent a lot of money and resources to put in this electronic control panel. But as a customer, it actually increased my gap 5 because my expectations went up and my experience was actually below what it would have been if the electronic control panel was not there, and if I was just as a regular customer, if I had to use just the manual switches. So the point here is that even today, there are many companies, many organizations, especially in this digital era, where companies are very eager to jump on the technology bandwagon and put in a lot of service innovations and service enhancements that they believe would delight customers, but might actually be having the opposite effect. So this also leads to tremendous waste of resources and leads to increased customer frustration. In fact, that's what I've tried to capture in this next diagram. So this chart on the left-hand side is simply a condensed version of the gaps model. You have the 4 internal gaps here, and gap 5 at the middle is the customer frustration, customer shortfall in terms of provision of quality of service by the organization. So these gaps collectively, to the extent that they are present in an organization, will negatively impact this triple bottom line, the PPP triple bottom line. In other words, each of the internal gaps, gaps 1 through 4, will adversely affect at least one of the P's. And if one of these P's is affected, the other P's are also affected because they're all interconnected. Another key concept, again, something that many of you might already be aware of, is from my research stream, is this CircWall instrument. The CircWall instrument is a measurement methodology that I have developed to be able to assess that external gap 5, customers' expectations and perceptions on the gap, the actual gap, to quantify the gap between customers' expectations and their perceptions. And this instrument actually took about 3 years to develop, but the bottom line is that the CircWall instrument consists of 5 major dimensions, all of which are core components of quality of service: reliability, responsiveness, assurance, empathy, and tangibles. And we've used the CircWall approach to study the quality of service in a number of different organizations in a number of different sectors. And consistently, what we find, what the empirical results show, is that reliability, which has to do with consistently delivering the promised or expected service, is the most important dimension. In fact, when we ask customers to distribute a total of 100 points across the 5 core dimensions of service quality, we almost invariably find that reliability is the most important dimension, which gets about 33% of the allocation of points as perceived by customers. And the least important dimension is typically the tangibles, the visual aspects of the service facility, the service interface, and so on, with the others kind of falling in between. Now, these percentages might vary slightly from sector to sector, but typically the pattern is remarkably consistent. So this is another idea that I would also like you to keep in mind as we move towards developing this linkage between service quality and sustainability. The last concept that I would also like to talk about a little bit that emerged from my service quality research stream is this concept of the nature of customer service expectations. A major portion of my research, about 2 to 3 years worth of research, focused on trying to understand expectations of customers, service expectations of customers, particularly in terms of what is the nature of customers' expectations and where do those expectations come from? What are the key drivers of customers' expectations? Why do customers have the expectations they do? So this was a lot of qualitative research, customer focus group interviews, again, and a variety of different sectors, and that's why this research took about 3 years to complete. But one of the key and very interesting concepts to emerge from that is that when we talk about customers' expectations, customers generally don't have just an ideal level of expectations. In fact, the nature of customers' expectations is such that most customers actually have a range of expectations rather than a single ideal level of expectations. The range that is bounded by the so-called desired level of service at the upper boundary. The desired level of service refers to the level that customers believe an organization can and should deliver. So it's kind of like the realistic ideal. It's a level of service that an excellent company can deliver and should deliver. And then the lower boundary of the zone of tolerance refers to what I call an adequate service. The adequate service is the minimum level of service that customers are willing to accept. So the zone of tolerance idea is a very simple idea, but it's a very powerful idea in the sense that to keep most customers reasonably satisfied, companies don't have to go beyond the desired level of service. As long as the level of service that they deliver falls somewhere within the zone of tolerance, customers will be reasonably satisfied, right? So that is the main idea. So from a company or organization's perspective, it's important to deliver a service that falls within the zone of tolerance. Don't let the service fall below the zone of tolerance, which will lead to a lot of customer frustration. Now, this is a very important idea that has emerged in the literature, in the service quality literature. Now, I think if you think about what I said earlier about the donut economics idea, you should already start to see a linkage between the zone of tolerance at the upper and lower boundary with the upper and lower boundary of the green donut that we saw earlier. So given that kind of analogy between the two, I created something analogous to the donut model that we saw from the economics literature in the form of this, what you see here on this chart. I'm calling this the Zono tolerance pentagon. Pentagon in the sense that the service quality arena, or the core of service quality, consists of these 5 dimensions: reliability, responsiveness, tangibles, empathy, and assurance. And just like the donut had an ecological outer boundary and a societal foundation inner boundary, as we saw before, we can overlay the zone of tolerance for these 5 dimensions in the form of the desired service level, which is the outer pentagon. The outer pentagon here is the desired service level, and the inner pentagon here is the adequate service level, and then we have the 5 dimensions. So this is a sort of a microcosm of the donut economics idea in the context of customer company interactions in a service quality type of domain. So now let's try to more formally link the donut economics idea with the gaps model and thereby create what I call a sustainability service quality framework. So here is a visual representation of what I call a sustainability service quality, or SSQ framework. And again, we've talked about all of these before, but just to kind of see what I mean by this framework, if you look at the left-hand side looks at sustainability at the societal and planetary level. It's kind of like the macro perspective that we saw earlier, the macro perspective that I began my presentation with. So we have the donut, and the core of the donut is really consisting of the various SDG-related attributes that we saw before. And then we have the ecological ceiling boundary as the outer boundary, and the social foundation minimum requirements as the inner boundary of the donut. Now, moving from the left-hand side to the right-hand side of the chart, you can see that at a micro level, we are looking at service quality at the company customer level. And here, service quality at the company customer level consists of closing that gap 5 within gap 5, which is the expectation perceptions gap on the customer side, as we saw earlier in discussing the gaps model, closing that gap 5 by closing the 4 internal gaps. And this needs to occur for all of these 5 dimensions. Once that is achieved, then service quality will be good. So the macro micro sort of sustainability service quality framework is a simple concept, because I'm just trying to look at the analogy between the micro aspects from economics and the micro aspect from the service quality perspective. But this is important because there is a lot of room for additional research by scholars, as well as companies can already be thinking about, in what ways can we make improvements within our service organizations at the micro level that might in turn be beneficial in terms of achieving these SDG type of salutary benefits. So there's a lot of things that can kind of stem from this overall 35,000-foot level framework trying to link sustainability and service quality. Now, just as an illustration of how this might work, I am borrowing from a chapter in a book called Marketing Services Competing Through Quality that I co-authored with Professor Len Berry almost over 3 decades ago. It was published in 1991. And the chapter is titled Managing and Exceeding Customers' Expectations. Okay, now what we mean by managing expectations, let me just focus on this thing first. Managing expectations means keeping customers' expectations under control, controlling the zone of tolerance. In other words, not over-promising and letting customers' expectations get out of hand. And in this chapter, we say that to properly manage expectations, companies can do several things. For example, first of all, they can ensure that promises reflect reality. What that means is that make sure that you don't overpromise, because overpromising pushes up expectations, and if you're not able to meet them, then gap 5 increases, right? So ensure that promises reflect reality. Placing a premium on reliability. As we already saw, reliability is the most important dimension of the 5 core dimensions of service quality. So by doing the service right the first time, not making a mistake, you can actually expand the customer zone of tolerance. By the same token, if you continuously make mistakes, the customer is going to get more and more frustrated, and the zone of tolerance is going to shrink. Communicate with customers. Keep customers informed of what's going on. That again can manage expectations in the sense that it can buy you more tolerance from customers. And then if you manage expectations properly, then you can move on to exceeding expectations. Now, this is where here I would like to suggest that some of my own theories about exceeding expectations need to be relooked in light of the sustainability service quality linkage framework. In other words, I'm saying that strategy and tactics for exceeding expectations, for example, delighting customers, need to be re-examined in light of sustainability concerns. Today, there's a lot of talk in the marketing literature about delighting customers. Delighting customers, you need to exceed customers' expectations. When you're dealing with customers, you have to pull out all stops, add a lot of bells and whistles to wow the customer. Now, I'm saying, is that really necessary? Is that really environmentally sound? Is it sustainable? Those are some questions that need to be raised. So from that perspective, I think this whole notion of do we even need to exceed expectations by putting in more resources, by putting in more bells and whistles to the nature of the service delivery to wow customers. In fact, one of my most recent publications deals with the subject. It talks about, toward a theory of customer delight. If you're interested, you can read this paper. It was just published in Journal of Service Management. And the key idea, based on a number of qualitative research, qualitative interviews that we did with customers in different sectors, one of the main ideas that emerge from our research and discussed in this paper is that you don't really have to exceed expectations to delight customers. Just doing the service as promised consistently and correctly over time, for example, can be a delightful experience for customers. Just sticking to your promises without making any mistakes can delight customers. In other words, there are multiple pathways that companies, organizations can use to actually delight customers without really having to overspend on resources. So this again is consistent with the whole notion of sustainability. And then finally, as another illustrative implication of the SSQ framework, I'm once again putting up this Pentagon. And you'll notice that the zone of tolerance, the yellow regions that you see on the outer boundary of the Pentagon, are of different widths for the different dimensions. For example, if you take reliability, which is the green, reliability, the zone of tolerance is narrow. And this again actually is supported by our empirical research on the zone of tolerance. Because reliability is the most important dimension, there's a lot less room for error. Customers are much more demanding, so the zone of tolerance is more narrow. On the other hand, if you take something like tangibles, which is the blue part of the Pentagon, the zone of tolerance can afford to be much wider. In fact, the zone of tolerance for tangibles is a little bit wider because tangibles, relatively speaking, is not as important to customers. So a key question here is that if the zone of tolerance has been shown to be different for different dimensions, or can be inferred to be different for different dimensions because of the differences in the relative importance, then can service quality be improved without necessarily increasing the resources needed to do so? It's kind of like a rhetorical question, and if I were to answer it, I will say yes, of course, it can be improved. For example, instead of focusing a lot of attention on tangibles, which is what many companies do even today, when they think about improving quality of service, they add a lot of exterior, visually pleasing kinds of things, and some of those things are very expensive. Even something like an electronic control panel is not an easy investment. It's a very expensive type of investment. These are intended to delight customers, but again, as we saw with the electronic control panel experience, it actually backfired in my case. So can we maybe spend a little bit less on tangibles? Because you're not going to hurt quality of service that much by spending a little bit less on tangibles, because customers, relatively speaking, don't care about tangibles as much as reliability, responsiveness, and so forth. So why don't we take some of the resources that we would normally have spent on sprucing up the facilities and so forth, and invest those to improve the reliability, improve the performance of employees, minimize the number of mistakes that employees make by proper training and so on. So there are a lot of opportunities. There are a lot of opportunities for improving quality of service by redistributing existing resources without spending more resources. So companies can already, in a practical sense, start to think about these things. And service scholars, researchers can systematically do research on trying to understand how do these reallocation of resources, how can they kind of contribute to sustainability, the SDGs. So there's a lot of opportunity for developing both conceptual work as well as empirical work based on this SSQ, so Sustainability Service Quality framework. And then one last slide that I would like to use before I conclude is what I call a typology of service innovations. On the horizontal, it's a 2x2 matrix with a horizontal axis and a vertical axis. On the horizontal dimension, I have scalability and sustainability of the invention. So before an organization actually implements a service innovation or implements a service enhancement that they are considering, they might want to look at, is it a scalable thing? Can be very economically provided on a large scale? Is it sustainable? Sustainable both from an economic standpoint, from a company's perspective, and also from an ecological, environmental standpoint. So is the scalability, sustainability high or low? Similarly, on the vertical axis, we have the innovation's likelihood of enhancing the target customer's service experience. Companies can start to think critically about, is this really going to add enjoyment or increase the customer's experience in terms of improve the customer's experience, or is it just a gimmick? So is the likelihood of enhancing the customer's, adding to the customer's experience high or low? And obviously, if it's low on sustainability and scalability and low on likelihood of enhancing the customer's experience, then it's a dumb innovation. You probably shouldn't be investing money in it. And I would say that the electronic control panel example would probably, at least for me, fall in this dumb category. Or at a minimum, even if it's scalable and sustainable, it may be unnecessary. If it's not going to significantly enhance the customer's experience, why even worry about it? It might be an unnecessary innovation or service enhancement. On the other hand, if a potential innovation is highly scalable, for example, it might be based on technology and so forth, because it's scalable to a lower extent. Because even though it might be technology based, it may involve a lot of human resources to help customers achieve this high level of enjoyment with it. But then what might happen is it might become unaffordable. Or to put it very simply, if you do whatever the customer wants you to do to enhance their experience, then it may not be sustainable, may not be and become unaffordable. So the sweet spot on this 2x2 matrix is really to be in the win-win quadrant, where the scalability, sustainability is high for the potential service innovation, and also the likelihood of enhancing the customer's experience is also high. So what do you do with potential service innovations that are in these two quadrants? Try to see if you can move them into the win-win quadrant. For example, if it's not going to be affordable, if this is something that at least some customers want, can we, for example, make that particular customer segment to pay more for it, so as to make that service innovation affordable for the company? In other words, you don't necessarily have to offer the innovation to all customers, segment customers, and offer it only to those customers who can afford to pay a price premium for it, and so on. Similarly, unnecessary investments can enhance the customer experience if you tweak it a little bit to appeal better to those customers. But the key part is that at all costs you want to avoid the dumb investments. And what do you do with the dumb investments that might already be there? Try to get rid of them, and whatever resources that are freed up by getting rid of those dumb investments, you can redistribute that to some of these other areas so that you can move most of your service enhancements into the win-win category. So this again sort of like a managerial implications, but there are also scholarly implications here in terms of how do you make improvements in service quality that have some implications for scalability and sustainability from an environmental sustainability perspective. So with that, let me stop, and I thank you for your attention and wish you all the best with the rest of the conference. And thank you very much for your patience, and I hope that I have planted some seeds in your minds, which will hopefully germinate into something useful and valuable for you. Thank you. Thank you very much.